In this video, we're going to talk about changes in matter and learn how to identify whether a change has been a physical change or a chemical change. There are a lot of changes that can occur in matter. So for one example, we could boil a kettle to make a cup of tea. We could burn gas to power our car. We could burn a candle and create a flame and even melt some of the candle wax. We could mix Kool-Aid with water to make a yummy drink. We could light a match. And finally, we could churn milk to make butter. All of these are examples of changes. Some of these changes are physical changes and some of them are chemical changes. A physical change is a change in matter where the particles remain the same, so the substance hasn't really changed even if the appearance has changed. So examples of physical changes might be a change in state, so melting an ice cube to water, chopping up a piece of wood into smaller pieces. It's still wood, but you don't have the log anymore. And also dissolving something in water, so like dissolving sugar into a cup of tea, for instance, would be an example of a physical change. These changes usually are easy to reverse, so we can go backwards and get the original substance. Some of them aren't as easy. You can't unchop a piece of wood, but you still have wood particles, so it hasn't changed chemically. It's still just a physical change. A chemical change is a change in matter where the substance is transformed into something new. So an example might be lighting a match, so burning a match, or cooking an egg. These types of change are hard to reverse. You can't uncook an egg. You can't unlight the match. It's been burnt. So you cannot reverse chemical changes very easily because the substance has transformed into something completely new. There are 5 clues that you can use to identify whether or not a chemical change has happened. So one clue would be a color change. So if you had a test tube with a red fluid in it and then something happened and you ended up having like a lime green fluid, there's a pretty good chance that a chemical change has happened. Another way of identifying a chemical change would be like if heat or light is released. So again, when you light a match, you get a flame, which releases both heat and light. So that's a pretty darn good clue that a chemical change has happened. If you mix something together and you get bubbles produced, like when you mix vinegar and baking soda, that's a clue of a chemical change. Another one has a little bit bigger word. So if you had a test tube with some liquid and then a solid formed inside the liquid, that solid's called a precipitate. So if precipitate forms, that's a clue of a chemical change. And the final clue of a chemical change is that the change is hard to reverse. So it's hard to go back. Now we're going to practice and see if we can identify the type of change. So the first one here with the kettle, boiling the kettle to make tea, this would be a physical change because we just changed the water into a new state. And even steeping a tea bag into a cup of water is still just a physical change because the tea particles are just spreading out in the water. So it's actually just dissolving. So that would be an example of a physical change. Our next one over here, when we burn gasoline to fuel our car, that would be an example of a chemical change. Anytime you hear burning would be an example of a chemical change because it's releasing heat to power the car. The candle, there's actually 2 different changes that are happening here. This first part up here, the flame, the burning part, would be a chemical change. So wax actually burns to reduce heat and light. But wax also, when it gets heated up, melts. So some of the wax isn't burning, it's just melting, becoming a liquid. And once you blow the candle out, that liquid wax will re-solidify, and then you can melt it again the next time or burn it the next time. Kool-Aid, making Kool-Aid, you're just dissolving the powder into the water. So this would be a physical change. Over here, lighting the match. Again, we're burning something, so this would be a chemical change. And then the milk one is a little tricky. You can't unchurn butter and get milk again, so there's actually some chemical changes that are happening when you make butter. Over here, we have some bubbles forming in the liquid, so I would think that this would be an example of a chemical change. Cooking something on the stove would be another example of a chemical change. You can't uncook a cake, you can't uncook food. Melting an ice cube would be a physical change, and then mixing some things together, so salt and pepper together, is a physical change. It's a little hard to separate the salt from the pepper because they're such tiny particles, but it would be an example of a physical change. Mixing oil and water together too would be another physical change. You have 2 layers, but you still have oil and vinegar, or oil and water.